Welcome back to the Beehive, everybody. Today we're going to start a several-part series called Blasts from the Past. We're going to talk about some early day United States Speedway riders, and we're going to talk a little bit about some stories of riders. We're going to remember the riders of yesteryear. We can start this story in 1968 at the revival of modern day Speedway. That was the year that the Speedway riders came from the flat track at Ascot and other venues. They came to the Whiteman Stadium in Pacoima, California. And there was a truck. There was an old pickup truck driving down the road. And there was a wife next door. Her name was Ida. And it was Jerry Fairchild. He's driving that old pickup truck. And guess what was in the back of the pickup truck? There was a bunch of old 1930s, 1940s, old JAP Speedway bikes. Jerry Fairchild was a mechanic of some of the early day greats in the 1930s, and here in the 1960s, he's come along with all these Speedway bikes to take them to Whiteman Stadium so all these riders can have a Speedway bike. The riders, they shared the Speedway bike. They actually didn't keep the Speedway bike. They were all Fairchilds, but they were sharing. So one rider would get done riding, they would refuel it with the methanol, and the next rider in the next heat would get on that Speedway bike and race that JAP. It was wild. That was because the riders didn't have a Speedway bike at the very beginning, and eventually they got the Speedway bikes. And there was an old Speedway rider in the 1950s. This is before the riders were really around. His name was Dude Criswell. Dude Criswell was the first promoter. He's the one who brought back Speedway in the modern era in America, and some called him the Shady Dude. Dude Criswell was shady. He was kind of, you know what he did? He was a racer. He was racing the Speedway bikes, trying to earn some money, and then he was promoting. He was trying to pocket money as a racer and pocket money as a promoter. However, they were racing at the Whiteman Stadium. That was the only track available. I believe it was like on a Saturday night. They had newcomers like Mike Bass and Steve Bass. With Uncle Harlan brought the Speedway bikes. And you had all these new flat track Speedway riders. They really didn't know how to ride the Speedway bike like we know how to ride today. They were flat trackers, so they rode the Speedway bike like flat track style. They rode it kind of like two-wheeling it and gassing it. It was a little different than we ride today. However, there was a rider by the name of Ivan the Great Major. Woo! In Europe, I believe he won his third world championship in a row. He came back over to the United States and came over to the Whiteman Stadium. And he was the big gun. He was the three-time world champion. And the Americans, they were making lap records every week. There was a new lap record, but they weren't as fast as Ivan's lap. And Ivan got there, and there was riders like Sonny Nutter. And when he saw Ivan, of course he didn't have much respect for Ivan, and he folded his arms and he looked at Ivan like, "You're not as good as we are." Ivan was mad. He was pissed off. He looked down at his Speedway bike to the manager and he said, "I didn't want to ride this JP. I wanted to ride my Jawa," because he was used to riding the Jawa. But there was no Jawa. There was just an old JP at that Whiteman Stadium. And Ivan, I think he brought some parts, some handlebars, some seats. He threw a couple of those parts on, but he was angry. He was pissed off because he didn't have anything that he liked on the Speedway bike. And all the riders, the Americans, they thought, "Oh, this guy's not very good." So Ivan, they started the JAP, went on the track, and he just opened that JAP up wide open. It was wide. It was screaming down the road, down the racetrack. And it was just incredible. Ivan Major set new lap records. The first lap he went around the Whiteman Stadium. All the Americans were like, oh my God. The American Speedway riders were shell-shocked. They were blown away when they saw Ivan Major ride and set those world records, those track records on the track at the Whiteman Stadium. And Ivan Major was disrespected at the very beginning, and after the first night, everybody was worshiping Ivan Majors. Ivan Major, he loved the American riders. He really loved those American riders. And he started teaching them how to ride, like Sonny Nutter, teaching Bill Cody, the Bass Brothers. And when Ivan Major spoke, people would listen. Everybody sucked up and absorbed everything that Ivan Major said. He was the greatest, the most unbelievable rider. He taught these flat trackers a new style of speedway, a stand-up, sliding, a totally new, different approach than flat track, and it was faster also. Dude Criswell might have been the shady promoter, but he was a good promoter too. He brought back team racing the first year of the Speedway in 1968. They had team racing. It got a little disorganized towards the end. They started sort of trading teams, making new teams up. But for several times, they actually had team racing. That was pretty innovative considering the American Speedway just came back. And at the end of the season, they had the first United States Speedway Championship. It was run at the Whiteman Stadium. And the first United States Speedway champion in 1968 was none other than the Rocket, Rick Woods. Rick Woods won the first United States Speedway Championship. The Speedway track at the Whiteman Stadium was held at the Whiteman Stadium Airport. There was an airport hangar, and right outside the hangar, there was a big circle concrete track, and in the middle of that concrete track, there was a Speedway track. And the stands were a little bit far behind the Speedway track, so the fans really didn't get up and close and personal, so it did take away a little bit from the excitement of the sport. However, there was two people that came to the 1968 revival of Speedway watching the races, and one of these guys was none other than Jack Milne, the 1937 world champion. And he was still like hanging out, and he had a car dealership in Pasadena, California, and he brought his manager, and that was none other than the Godfather, Harry Oxley. They came and checked out the Speedway, and they were thinking like, we can do something with this sport. And they realized that Speedway needed to be more like up close and personal. The people, the crowds needed to be closer to the sport. They needed to smell that castor oil. They needed that mud flying in their face. They needed up close and personal, watching the crashes. You know, Jack Milne and Harry Oxley, they said, you know, we can do a Speedway track. And that was it, the first year of organized modern day Speedway at the Whiteman Stadium. It was kind of successful. A lot of new riders came, and all throughout the year, and stars became famous, and it just became really good. And Harry Oxley and Jack Milne, they start working on that Speedway track at the Costa Mesa Fairgrounds. They went to the fair board, had meetings. They said, we can put a Speedway track at the Costa Mesa Fairgrounds, and the fair board agreed with it. And the Speedway at the Whiteman Stadium was successful, and everybody had a great time. It was the beginning. It was a blast from the past, and it was the start of the revival of the modern day Speedway.